By the time the file resurfaced, it had already been declared dead twice. Once in 2006, when the paperwork quietly labeled the case inactive. And again in 2014, when a flood at the county records office destroyed most of the physical evidence tied to it. So when a state cold case analyst reopened the digital archive in 2019, the disappearance of a 24-year-old nursing student from Louise, Mississippi appeared at first glance to be nothing more than a clerical echo, an entry that had outlived its relevance. No suspects. No remains. No confirmed sightings after the first week. Just a woman who had vanished, and a town that had moved on. Before we head forward into today's unsettling story, please make sure you support the channel by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next case just like this one. The analyst didn't begin with the disappearance itself. He began with what shouldn't have been there. A maintenance permit request, filed 13 years after the woman went missing, flagged an abandoned hunting structure near the edge of Steel Bayou, several miles northeast of Louise. The permit referenced the removal of obsolete storage materials buried beneath the structure's flooring. The phrase was vague, almost deliberately so. What caught attention wasn't the request, but the attachment. A single, grainy photograph embedded in the system metadata. It showed the corner of a wooden box. Rectangular. Reinforced. Too long to be a cooler. Too carefully sealed to be scrap. And on one side of the crate, barely visible through dirt and water stains, was a hand-painted marking that didn't belong in any inventory system. A number. 24. That number alone was enough to reopen a case that had not been spoken aloud in over a decade. Back in 2005, the woman had been in her final year of nursing school. She lived in a modest rental on the southern edge of Louise, close enough to Highway 49 that the sound of trucks passing through town became background noise. She worked rotating shifts at a regional medical center outside Silver City, commuting daily along rural roads that locals barely noticed anymore. She was white, 24, academically driven, and widely considered predictable. Which is why, when she failed to show up for a scheduled overnight shift in late autumn, the absence initially registered as an inconvenience rather than an alarm. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her car wasn't in the driveway. Her uniform was still folded on the chair where she always left it. By the second day, concern grew, but not urgency. A delayed report. A suggestion she needed space. A theory she left town with someone. Within 72 hours, the narrative began to shift without evidence. The official record would later describe her as possibly transient by choice. That single line shaped everything that followed. Her car was found 4 days later along a rural stretch near Bentonia Road, nose angled slightly toward a drainage ditch as though it had been pulled over intentionally. There were no skid marks. No visible damage. The hood was warm when first responders arrived. The battery was dead. Inside the vehicle, nothing appeared disturbed. Her bag was gone. Her phone wasn't recovered. No blood. No struggle. The location itself was unremarkable, a place drivers passed daily without remembering. That familiarity worked against the investigation. Search efforts expanded outward in widening circles that found nothing except fields, tree lines, and waterlogged ground. By the end of the second week, active searching slowed. By the end of the month, it stopped. What no one could have known then was that the most critical mistake wasn't procedural, it was temporal. Because the woman was not gone. She was hidden. And by the time the analyst reopened the case in 2019, the land itself had changed enough to begin revealing what had been buried. The hunting structure near Steel Bayou was scheduled for demolition due to erosion concerns. It sat on leased land once used seasonally by private parties and then abandoned. Over the years, flooding had shifted the soil beneath it, causing sections of the floor to sink unevenly. When workers lifted the warped boards, they found something that should not have been there. A box. It was buried shallowly, wedged between concrete footings, sealed with metal clasps that had rusted into place. The wood was thick, industrial, not handmade, and reinforced internally with brackets designed to prevent collapse under pressure. It was shaped unmistakably like a coffin. The discovery halted demolition immediately. Local authorities were notified, and the search team arrived expecting the worst. The dimensions matched an adult body. The box had been intentionally concealed. The surrounding soil suggested it had been placed there deliberately, not discarded. Everything about it pointed toward a grave. And yet, when forensic specialists finally opened the lid, they did not find a body. They found scratches on the inside walls, fabric fibers embedded beneath the hinges, and a broken plastic clasp from a hospital-issued ID holder lodged near the base. The box had once been occupied, but it was empty. That realization reframed the entire case. If the woman had been confined there, and had escaped, then someone else knew exactly where she had been, and that someone had believed, for years, that she was still inside. The box was transported for analysis. Soil samples were taken. Tool marks were catalogued. Every detail was documented with the sudden intensity of a case reborn too late. But the most unsettling discovery came days later, during a deeper sweep of the area. Just beyond the structure, partially submerged in thick undergrowth, search teams located a secondary trench. Inside it were items preserved by water and clay, a length of rope, a cracked flashlight, and a notebook, its pages blank except for impressions pressed deep into the paper. Indentations left by writing that had once existed. By the end of the week, the question was no longer what happened to her. It was how long had she been missing after she was supposed to be dead? And why, after all this time, had no one ever come forward to explain the box? As the search expanded outward, investigators began to understand that the disappearance in 2005 hadn't been the beginning of the crime. It had only been the moment it stopped being visible. And somewhere between Louise and the bayou, a person who believed their secret was buried was about to learn that the ground remembers everything. For 13 years, the disappearance of the 24-year-old nursing student from Louise had lingered in local memory like a whisper, acknowledged only when the topic arose, never fully discussed. Now, with the box unearthed and the trench revealed, investigators had a new lens through which to view the case. Every detail from 2005 suddenly demanded reconsideration. The first breakthrough came not from the soil samples, the clasped box, or the faint impressions in the notebook. It came from routine interviews with people who had crossed paths with the woman in the weeks leading up to her vanishing. Co-workers remembered her as meticulous, driven, polite, and, above all, observant. She noticed details others missed. The odd way someone might glance around before speaking, the subtle tremor in a patient's voice when they were lying. Those traits, they said, were what made her such a promising nursing student, and what might have saved her life. The pattern emerged when the analysts cross-referenced the interviews with her final known movements. She had accepted a ride from a local handyman, a man whose outward demeanor was calm, even genial. He lived in a small, aging cabin on the outskirts of the county, near marshland and back roads few people traveled. He was known to some neighbors as reclusive but harmless, a fixer of fences and farm equipment, a man who could seem invisible to those who didn't look closely. The authorities pieced together that he had lured her into his vehicle by offering to drive her after she had been stranded along a rural road with a dead battery. From there, the narrative shifted from chance encounter to deliberate abduction. Inside his cabin, investigators later determined, he had created a temporary containment space. It wasn't sophisticated. There were no electronic locks, no high-tech surveillance, nothing cinematic. Just a reinforced wooden box, hidden in the far corner of a storage shed, bolted and wedged to withstand collapse, and enough darkness to make anyone inside doubt that light would ever return. But it wasn't only the physical confinement that mattered, it was the psychological manipulation. 4 months, the woman had endured isolation and deprivation. Investigators discovered she had been systematically misled, told that no one would come looking for her, that family and friends had forgotten her. Notes she had left scratched into surfaces, partially preserved in fragments discovered by forensic teams, revealed her attempts to remind herself of reality. Breathe. Remember who you are. Watch him. Wait. She studied her captor closely, noting routines, habits, and vulnerabilities. He had a consistent drinking pattern and an irrational fear of thunderstorms. Those details became her lifeline, her strategy for survival. Even in total darkness, she observed, remembered, and planned. Meanwhile, the original investigation had faltered almost immediately. The local sheriff's department initially dismissed her disappearance as a voluntary absence. Despite pleas from her closest relatives, particularly her grandmother, authorities labeled her a transient runaway. Evidence was overlooked: her abandoned car, her missing belongings, the last known interactions with neighbors. Officers on the case later admitted to seeing nothing that suggested foul play, though in hindsight, the conclusion appeared dangerously premature. The cold case analysts in 2019 discovered files that had never been examined. Complaints of harassment lodged against the handyman years earlier had never been connected to her disappearance. A neighbor had reported strange behavior, shouts, the smell of something rotting in the shed, but the reports were lost in bureaucratic shuffle. It seemed almost as though the very act of ignoring the signs had been the invisible accomplice to the abduction. As the forensic team analyzed the box itself, subtle clues spoke volumes. Marks along the interior would indicated that someone had attempted to loosen the bolts. Scratches, likely from fingernails or improvised tools, suggested deliberate effort over time. Fibers from her clothing were embedded in the corners, proof that she had been inside and had interacted with the structure. Even more curious, inside the trench, the rope, flashlight, and notebook pointed to an interrupted plan. Whoever had created the containment or burial site had left in haste, possibly believing the woman remained trapped. And that, investigators realized, was the twist the public would never know. The woman had escaped long before the discovery of the crate. Reconstructing her survival required patience. Analysts theorized that she had spent months quietly studying her captor, memorizing patterns, and exploiting weaknesses. Each day had been a test of endurance, observation, and restraint. The broken clasp from her hospital ID indicated she had improvised tools from whatever she could salvage. The slight imperfection in the bolt, the loose nail, the crack in the crate's wood, all became opportunities. Her escape likely coincided with one of the handyman's predictable vulnerabilities. Perhaps a storm, perhaps his drinking, whatever it was, it created a moment where she could act. She took it. And the marshes, the back roads, and the rural terrain became her allies in the night, as she disappeared into the world she had once left behind under duress. For investigators, the case posed a paradox. She was alive, yet they had no current trace of her. The physical evidence suggested that someone believed she remained captive. The box, meticulously placed, was intended as a secret grave, a warning, and an assurance to the perpetrator that his crime was unchallenged. Now, 13 years later, her story was coming to light in fragments. Analysts combed through interviews, cross-checked old case files, and mapped every movement from the night she vanished. The psychological profile of her captor began to emerge: meticulous, controlling, and confident that the secret of his crime would never surface. Yet the crime scene, the reinforced crate, the hidden trench, the notebook with impressions of her writing, revealed that his overconfidence had left critical evidence. And as the team examined the site more closely, they discovered an overlooked detail: faint tire tracks in the mud surrounding the shed. They were subtle, partially washed away by flooding over the years, but discernible enough to suggest that a vehicle had been repeatedly driven to the location, likely for placing the crate and returning to check on it. The chilling realization came quickly. The perpetrator had returned multiple times, confident no one was watching. And if he had believed the woman remained trapped, that meant he had been entirely unaware that she had escaped. This revelation reframed the entire case. Investigators now had to ask, how had she survived in the first place? Where had she gone afterward? And, perhaps most importantly, who else had knowledge of the crate, the trench, or the items buried around the shed? The answer remained elusive. Even after the forensic evidence and archival research, the identity of the perpetrator, and whether he had returned to the site over the years, was uncertain. All that was certain was that he had operated with precision and had assumed a level of control he did not truly possess. And for the analyst who reopened the case, the implications were staggering. Here was a woman who had survived unimaginable conditions, whose captor believed she remained a victim, and yet the investigation that began in 2005 had failed to see any of it. The box, the trench, the items found within, they were all remnants of a crime long thought unsolvable. But the woman's escape had created an invisible thread, connecting her survival to the present moment and forcing the case into daylight once more. As the team prepared for a wider sweep of the area, aiming to recover any additional evidence that might indicate who had returned to the site over the years, they uncovered something unexpected. Footprints that led away from the trench, partially obscured by overgrowth, but unmistakable in size and stride. They seemed to have been made by someone moving with care, deliberately avoiding detection. Possibly the same person who had placed the crate, possibly someone entirely new. The implications were clear. The perpetrator, or someone connected, may have returned in the past decade, unaware that the woman had survived. And with every footstep, the evidence of his arrogance was preserved, waiting for investigators to finally piece together the truth. The morning the search team returned to Steel Bayou, the air was thick with fog. The dampness clung to their clothes, to the edges of their gloves, to the soles of their boots. The reinforced crate and the shallow trench had been carefully documented, but now the team's task was to understand the full extent of what had occurred 13 years earlier. Forensic analysts moved deliberately, photographing every inch, measuring the soil displacement, examining the interior and exterior of the box again. The faint scratches inside, the fibers from her clothing, and the broken clasp had already told part of the story. She had been inside. But there was something more subtle, something almost imperceptible in the soil and mud patterns that suggested she hadn't been idle. She had fought to survive. The team theorized her escape. The captor had left the shed for a short period, perhaps to check a vehicle or tend to a task, unaware that the woman had been quietly preparing for months. She had exploited every weakness, loose bolts, small gaps in the wood, even her own familiarity with human behavior. Her tools were minimal, improvised from the fragments of the items in the crate and shed. A broken nail from a bracelet, a frayed piece of rope from the shed, a loosened bolt, all small victories measured in patience and observation. On a stormy night, when wind and rain masked sound and movement, she had acted. The violent pounding of water on the shed, the thunder that sent her captor into fear, the brief moments he had left her alone, they combined to create the perfect window. With sheer determination, she had slipped out, crawling through the confined space, pushing open the crate's lid, and navigating the rising floodwaters that surrounded the structure. She emerged soaked, emaciated, and exhausted, but alive. Her route away from the shed took her across the marshes, over fallen logs, and along the meandering paths of rural backroads she knew from prior walks and commutes. Every step required careful calculation, her body battered but her mind sharp, keeping her aware of any possible witnesses or returning threats. The first person to encounter her was a truck driver who had been delivering supplies to a nearby farm. He initially thought she was a lost hiker or traveler caught in the storm. Her clothes were tattered, her hands raw from gripping branches and debris, and her voice hoarse. But her eyes, alert, intelligent, determined, conveyed the story more powerfully than words ever could. The driver immediately called the authorities, and she was transported to a local hospital. Medical professionals described her condition as critical but stable. She had survived without access to basic sustenance for weeks, relying on the marshes, rainfall, and small scraps she had managed to find. Her account, once pieced together, shocked investigators. They learned not only the timeline of her captivity, but also the meticulous methods her captor had employed to control and deceive. He had convinced her that no one was searching, that her family had forgotten her, that hope was gone. Every message she had received, every manipulation she had endured, had been calculated to break her spirit. But she had endured. And in the quiet moments of the shed, she had planned her escape with the precision of someone who understood human behavior and survival instinct in equal measure. The investigation quickly shifted focus. The crate and the items surrounding the shed were carefully collected, preserved, and analyzed. Fingerprints, footprints, soil samples, and impressions from the notebook were examined for any sign of the captor. Yet the perpetrator remained a ghost. No arrests were made immediately, and no names surfaced in connection with the crime. Every lead seemed to dissolve into shadows. Neighbors who might have seen something didn't, records were incomplete, and the man himself had vanished into obscurity, likely unaware that his captive had survived and that the box he had so carefully hidden no longer contained the victim he believed was trapped. The case became one of paradoxical closure. The woman had survived, escaped a nightmare, and lived to tell her story. But the person responsible remained unknown, their identity obscured by time, careful planning, and rural isolation. Years later, investigators would reflect on the small details that allowed her survival. Her observation skills, the broken bracelet, the loose bolt, the storm that terrified her captor. Every minor element contributed to the grand outcome, a miraculous escape from what should have been a fatal confinement. The crate remains preserved in evidence storage. It stands as a silent reminder of both human cruelty and human resilience. The trench, the rope, and the notebook fragments were carefully catalogued, studied, and archived for potential future use. For viewers of the story today, the takeaways are clear. Even in extreme confinement, careful observation, patience, and intelligence can create a path to survival. Not every crime resolves neatly. Some perpetrators are never brought to justice. Evidence, no matter how small or overlooked, can resurface years later and rewrite history. And while the woman's story is extraordinary, it is also chilling. Somewhere, her captor, or someone aware of the events, may still be alive, never knowing that the person they had attempted to control and erase had survived. The marshes of Steel Bayou, the backroads of Louise, Mississippi, and the abandoned shed remain the silent witnesses. The crate, empty and weathered, holds no body, but it does hold a lesson. A lesson about observation, courage, resilience, and the unforeseen consequences of underestimating a victim. Even today, authorities remind us that some questions remain unanswered. How many others might have disappeared unnoticed? How many crimes might hide in plain sight, waiting for the earth and time to reveal them? The woman's survival is a victory, but it is also a haunting reminder that darkness can persist, sometimes for decades, before the truth finally emerges. Was her captor ever close to being caught, or did he get away with it all these years? Let me know your theories in the comments. And if you want to see more unbelievable true crime stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what's coming next.